Guys, so I did my 6th series, and like I said, I was going to talk about my son and the Xbox and this creep pretending to be a kid on the Xbox. And I already did this video last week, and TikTok was lagging. I uninstalled the app, I listened to a bunch of people, and I also read about it too. I also didn't read that when you uninstall the app, it deletes your drafts, so don't do that. So I gotta kind of remember what I said because it was 2 videos long and it was pretty good. It was all together, so I'll just try my best to remember what I put. So I guess where I'll start off is where I first realized that this guy was behind these accounts on the Xbox. And I think it was about maybe like 2-3 days before I initially shut down all my accounts. And, I was on the laptop, I was on my phone, I was doing my investigations, I was just doing a bunch of stuff. And I was sitting on my balcony, or my patio, sorry. And I was thinking about all the things that this guy could know about me, which is a lot as far as I'm concerned. But the most important question that came to mind was, does he know where we live? Does he know where my son goes to school? And since this guy was pretending to be my friends, one of them was a friend that I had way before my son was even born. And I remember this account asking me which school he goes to, and I thought it was my friend, so I told her. But there was something I just couldn't put my finger on it. I don't know what it was, but I just couldn't get my mind focused off of where else this guy would find out where my son went to school. And all of that came to mind was this kid that he played with on the Xbox named Sniper, is what we called him. And I know it sounds really unrelated, but it's not. It ties into everything. But like I said, I was sitting on the patio. My son comes home from school. And I ask him, I say, is there any way you could have told somebody that you're playing on the Xbox with where you live? And my son's a really honest kid. And yeah, right away he told me. He said, yeah, he told his friend Sniper where he went to school. And, my first initial reaction was like, telling him, do you remember all the talks we had? Because I went through it with him. I wouldn't even let him play on the Xbox unless the other player was on the mic and I could hear it was a kid. I wouldn't let him play with anybody that wasn't talking on the mic. I had to hear that they were a kid. And then, I told my son, you never tell anybody where you go to school under any circumstances. And that's when he told me that this kid told him where he went to school, where he lived. And, I just figured it out that he was just manipulated into it. And, it wasn't long before I realized for sure that it was this guy behind this account, because this Sniper kid was always around from the time a little bit after I met this guy, and he would get blocked all the time, and he'd create a new account and he would re-add my son and they would play games, and it just, I let it go on. I just thought he was just a kid, he really wanted to play video games with my son, so I let it go all the time. I could hear him on the mic. But here's the really messed up part is the mic. And remembering back when I remember talking to this guy, and I remember telling him about my rules about letting my son play online on the Xbox. And he knew how much of a protective mom I am. He knew that, there's only certain things I shared online. He wasn't allowed to play with anyone on the Xbox, like I said, unless they're on the mic. So he knew that. But, when we kind of put 2 and 2 together that this guy was behind it, the only thing I could think of was how distorted how his voice sounded very distorted on the mic. But, not being aware of anything, I didn't think anything of it. And it's not like my son was far away. We lived in a multi-split home. So, he was down the stairs, but there were only a few stairs. I was an earshot away. I could hear everything that was going on. I could hear them yapping back and forth. I really thought nothing of it. But when we were both floored with the fact that this guy was behind those accounts, and we sat down and we talked about it, we talked about this guy's mannerisms, his dialect, his behavior, the things that he says, and it all lined up to a T. My son was describing this same guy, but in a kid form. And when we made the realization, that's when I thought back to all the times that I heard him on the mic. And I remember thinking it did sound weird. But I just thought he was a weird kid. It never crossed my mind that this guy would have ever used a voice changer, stooped that low, just to get that, access from a different angle of my life, which was my kid, right? And here's kind of the backstory about this. I think it was 2020. It was when my son and I were living in a basement suite. It was a total different era of my life, and it was quite a while after I rejected this guy. It was months and months. He was still stalking me. I was pretty well aware, but at that point, I was just ignoring him. I was doing my own thing. I was in school. I had a lot going on. But I remember my son started playing games with this kid named Sniper. And because it was COVID, I thought it was great. He had a buddy that he could play with online because so many people were isolated during that time. And, he bypassed everything. He was on the mic. They played games. But another thing that was weird is they fought all the time. And that's, and it's weird thinking about it now. Before I realized it was this guy, I just thought they were kids, and they would fight so bad that I would have to either kick my son off the game, give him a warning, because he never really got like that. I get kids get mad, but they got, this guy would really rile my son up to the point where I would demand him to block this guy. And, some time would go by, and this Sniper guy would remake a new account, add my son behind my back, and they tell each other, oh, I won't tell my mom, and, whatever kids do, right? And, it's funny thinking about it being a kid, but it's not funny thinking about it being an adult. It's really creepy. And that's the thing about predators and, why they're called this for a reason, but this is what predators do to children. It's called grooming, and I know it's not in the typical way that we all know what grooming is. In this case, he was trying to gain my son's trust just so he could get information out of him. And it didn't happen overnight. Like I said, I'm pretty sure it was 2020 when he added him as a friend. It might have been a little bit later, but it was on and off throughout the years, just on the Xbox. And that's the thing about the fighting is I don't know if it was true fighting, this guy was actually mad because my son was beating him in the game. I believe he made the connection and he was just really trying to mess with my son. Honestly, I don't know what would make a grown man argue with a kid online like that the way that they did. And then jumping back to the mic, I really sat and thought about it. And actually, this is something I didn't even think of till about a few days ago. And I remember going up to my son and being like, whoa, another thing came to my head. And I remember when I would hear them and I would go downstairs, because I was curious. And it might have just been my own inner intuition, telling me something. But I remember I would go downstairs a couple times and, I kind of just see what they were doing, what they were up to. And he would go silent no matter what. And I just thought he was just a shy kid. I didn't think anything of it. But now realizing it, every time I came near the console and I came to talk to my son, and I'd purposely try and get this Sniper kid to talk. Just curiosity, like I said, my intuition. And it was always silent every time I went by, no matter what. He would not even say hi. He wouldn't reply. I'd come down and, just try and be friendly and nothing. And I'm just looking back and thinking about it now, and it's probably because I would have noticed his voice was off, to a kid. He might, my son wouldn't notice. He's a kid. Why would he think that, right? He passed the rule of, okay, his kid's on the mic and that's all he cares about. He's playing the games. He's not thinking on the level that I would be if I was to hear this guy on the mic. And looking back, he did sound really messed up. Anyways, running out of time. I'll have a part 2 for this.